So dear beloved community, it's such a joy to be together with you on this, the 25th day of October in the year 2020. Here I'm sitting in Mountain Spring Monastery in the Blue Mountains where the rain is falling heavily. It's such a beautiful thing to be sitting and listening to the rain. And as I was sitting and listening to the rain earlier this afternoon, it came to my consciousness that I really wanted to share that insight doesn't arise from thinking. It doesn't arise from cogitating about something, but from bringing mindfulness and concentration and cultivating the factors of awakening in each and every moment, just as that moment is, whether it's a pleasant moment, whether it's a painful moment, or whether that moment is mixed. Being willing to do that, being willing to bring mindfulness and concentration to each and every moment just as it is a fruit of the practice that I like to call not running away. It's the capacity to stay with what's arising in every moment just as it is, to not try to run away, to not try to find a peace that's somehow separate from the experience of this moment. That takes courage. That's fierce. As I mentioned in Mountain Spring here, it's raining heavily today, and it looks like it'll be raining for almost the whole week. And I've been thinking of a poem by Ryokan. Today, there's been a few haiku poems that have tapped me on the shoulder, and there's one that has been with me the whole of today, and I'll share it now. The poem is, in an old temple, Mount Koya, I listened to raindrops falling from a cedar tree. In an old temple, Mount Koya, I listened to raindrops falling from a cedar tree. So here I am in a very new temple, just a few months old in the Blue Mountains, listening to raindrops falling from eucalypts. But that experience of listening is really, for me, the heart of meditation, the heart of spiritual practice, opening up a space of availability for what's there. And we all know, even by looking at the word listen, that it contains the same letters as the word silent. In order to actually hear something, to hear a sound, or to hear the experience of our life, we need to stop our talking. We need to close our mouth or close the continual narrative of our mind to just open this space of availability for our lived experience. So at its heart, for me, I feel that meditation practice is about learning to listen to each and every experience of our life, of opening a space of availability for what's there, of being able and willing to look deeply into each and every experience, allowing ourselves to be called forth. So this evening, we're going to be continuing on with the third poem in the Atthakavagga, the Book of Eights. It's hard to believe that we've been exploring together and looking deeply into the Book of Eights for about 6 weeks now. So the time is flying. I'm personally enjoying it so much. This text is so rich and so deep, and at best, I can only offer a few very simple pointing out instructions that I hope will be helpful. So this third poem, which is sometimes called the poem on the corruptions of the mind, is the first poem in the Book of Eights in the current collection that we're looking at that has its focus on views. The last two poems, as you'll recall, focused on different aspects of craving or thirst or this longing to become something. And I feel that in a way, it's perfect timing for us to be looking over the next couple of weeks at views, for us to be exploring views and attachment to views and positions, given the intensifying of views that are swirling around at the moment, political and otherwise. The third poem in this collection focuses mainly on exploring philosophical or religious views. So while we were looking at the Noble Eightfold Path in a previous series of teachings, we explored what's meant by the practice of developing right view in Buddhism. Right view is the very first step and actually the fruit of the cultivation of the Noble Eightfold Path. Right view is the starting point and the foundation of the entire path. And it's a guide for all the other factors. And it's also the fruit and the culmination of our practice, because as we develop all the other factors, then all the other factors in a beautiful feedback loop nurture the development of right view. The practice of cultivating right view in Buddhism, or clear seeing things clearly, is quite different from taking on another set of views. It's an embodied awareness that enables us to understand where we are and why we're practicing, as well as the successive landmarks that we pass as our practice advances. In the earlier series, we also explored the relationship between right view, or cultivating clear seeing, and the practice of letting go of views and notions. It's probably helpful to consider at this point what the Buddha himself said about cultivating right view. The Buddha, when he was asked to define right view, shared the following, and you can find this text in the long length sayings, the Digha Nikaya, Sutra or Sutta number 22. And what is right view? It's knowledge with regard to suffering, knowledge with regard to the origination of suffering, knowledge with regard to the cessation of suffering, and knowledge with regard to the way of practice leading to the cessation of suffering. This is called right view. So please notice something important here. The Buddha said knowledge with regard to these things, which are the very foundation of our existence. He didn't say more ideas, concepts, and notions about these things, or invite us to take on ideas from others. He invited us to have direct knowledge of these aspects, these foundational aspects of experience, coming from our embodied experience from deep within each one of us. So please remember that the practice of Buddhism at its core is to cultivate right view, not just cultivate views or more views. We're all experts in that. We're all experts in holding views. But to be fair, our views are almost without exception not clear view, or not complete. Right view in Pali is sammaditthi. We normally translate samma as right, but it can also mean complete. So complete view, seeing something from all aspects, including and most importantly from within. Ditti, which we translate as view, can also mean vision or seeing. And I really like that translation. In fact, as I've shared before, when we moved here and we settled in what has become the Brothers Hamlet here in Mountain Spring Monastery, we named this hamlet the Hamlet of Cultivating Clear View. And the Buddha said in another text in the Anguttara Nikaya that he saw no single factor as so responsible for the arising of unwholesome states of mind as wrong view, and no factor as helpful for the arising of wholesome states of mind as right view. Again, he said that there's no single factor so responsible for our suffering, our ill-being, as wrong view, and no factor as powerful in promoting good of living beings as right view. this kind of insight, this penetrating insight into the nature of things, doesn't come from books. It'd be great if it did, or if it came from talks, but rather it's from the Dharma bursting forth in your own life, through you putting in the effort to actually apply these teachings in each and every moment, and not behaving like a victim of samsara anymore, but to know that we have the capacity to wake up and to choose to apply a Dharma door, something as seemingly simple as mindfulness of breathing, which will open all the other Dharma doors of practice for us. So the poem that we're exploring this week focuses on the ways that we relate to views and dogmas and doctrines, and it looks specifically at the motivations behind these views and our attachment to these views, the worldviews we create around our own views. In this poem that we'll be exploring this evening, we're offered a reflection that most often, if we're not careful on a subtle or not so subtle level, actually our untransformed desires and preferences are intertwined with our spiritual beliefs. In fact, in this poem, there's the theme of, or the invitation for us to consider that we may even tend to hold particular views, because as the poem reminds us, unconsciously we think it's to our advantage. Our advantage here refers to the tendency that we have as human beings to build up a barrier to protect our idea of self. And this gives us a kind of temporary peace, but it's a very unstable kind of peace. It's the peace that's the peace of a fortress or a castle that is under siege. It's a temporary reprieve at most. That fortress is liable to be broken down at any moment. And as a meditator, as a spiritual practitioner, rather than building up even more layers around ourselves, we want to be practicing to peel them away. So the main theme of this poem is the importance for each one of us to recognize how entrenched we are, entrenched in our views, in our notions, in our ideas, and also often in doctrines or dogmas. And this poem offers a somewhat radical message that the person that is free, the wise person, has no need for views, or as the last verse states, has shaken off every kind of view. In particular, this poem reminds us that a sage, a wise person, doesn't form views about states of becoming or non-becoming, as we explored last week. So why don't we enjoy a sound of the bell, just coming back to our breathing, coming back to our bodies. You might even be hearing the sound of the rain coming through the microphone, so you can also enjoy the sound of the rain. And then we'll hear the poem in its entirety and have some reflections on each of the verses. So the third poem. Some enter debates being corrupted at heart. Others debate with their hearts set on truth. A sage, a wise person, enters no debate, regardless of the issue. Therefore, the wise one is nowhere constrained. Now, how would a person led on by their desires, entrenched in their likes, forming conclusions from this basis, overcome their own views, since they view them as reality? Whoever boasts to others unasked of their self, their practices, their precepts, and their virtues is the skilled say of ignoble nature. But that practitioner who is serene at heart and praises neither their own self, practices, or virtue, not labeling themselves I in this, the wise would praise them, calling them a noble one. Such a person no longer has any arrogance or vanity for anything in the world. Those whose doctrines arise from their own unpurified thinking, giving preference to these imagined, constructed, and conventional views when it is to their self-advantage. Such a person relies on a peace that can easily be shaken. Entrenchments in views are not easily overcome, especially when one considers what doctrines we grasp onto. In fact, that's usually why someone embraces or rejects a doctrine, in light of these very entrenchments themselves. Now, one who is cleansed does not form preconceived views about states of becoming or not becoming anywhere in the world. Having abandoned conceit and illusion, by what means would they continue on, since they're no longer caught up in attachment? The one who is still attached enters into doctrinal debates. But if one is unattached, how could they take sides? For such a person with no self and nothing that is opposed to the self, embraces nothing, rejects nothing, and shakes off all views, relying on none. So, dear community, I do see the irony in reading this incredibly powerful transmission of wisdom from the heart of the Buddha about shaking off all views. And then here I am sharing my views about this poem, which is about letting go of all views. So please, please also enjoy the irony. So we'll have a little look at each verse, going through and sharing a few pointing out instructions of each verse. So the first verse reads, "Some enter debates being corrupted at heart. Others debate with their hearts set on truth. The wise person, the sage, enters no debate, regardless of the issue. Therefore, the wise one is nowhere constrained." So it'll probably come as no surprise to any of you that I used to be in debate club when I was in high school. And I loved traveling around to debate various issues. There were times that we'd know the topic in advance, but other times we'd only find out the topic when we arrived at the venue. And then by a coin toss, we were either to support the topic or to argue against it. So debate here, in the context of this poem, doesn't mean debate club, but rather it means setting ourselves up with a fixed position on something. When we hold a fixed position, this poem reminds us it's usually based on our entrenchments. A good way to identify entrenchment is when we notice that there is a sense of an other, a they, whether it's a they of another person, a group of people, a nation, a political view, or even it's just another person's opinion, and we have a sense that that's other, and we close down to it, or we be closed down by becoming defensive, and we experience it as separate. In our evening sitting meditation chant in Plum Village, we hear the line, "Body, speech, and mind are one in stillness. There is no more thought of right and wrong." our minds and bodies dwell in perfect mindfulness, and we rediscover our original nature, leaving the shore of illusion behind. In this first stanza, corrupted at heart means not seeing clearly and operating from our own habit energies rather than from insight. As we read in the second of the 14 mindfulness trainings of the Order of Interbeing, we are determined to avoid being narrow-minded and bound to present views. We're committed to learning and practicing non-attachment to views. We're aware that the knowledge we presently possess is not changeless, absolute truth. Insight is revealed through the practice of compassionate listening, deep looking, and letting go of notions, rather than through the accumulation of intellectual knowledge. Truth is found in life, and we will observe life within and around us in every moment, ready to learn throughout our lives. So a notion is an idea that we've taken on from others, but that we've not necessarily discovered for ourselves or embodied in our own lives as a lived reality. And this is actually quite scary for many of us if we look deeply into how we cling on to notions and ideas. Since we usually tend to think of the spiritual life or spiritual practice or of insights in terms of attainments, rather than as we're invited with the worldview that's presented in the Book of Eights, as a continual practice of letting go of ideas, of identifications, of notions, and of things. A couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to visit Great Vow Zen Monastery in Oregon for a gathering of Buddhist teachers. And one afternoon, we were enjoying a walking meditation. And we took a walking meditation to a shrine that's on the grounds of that monastery called the Shrine of Vows. It's a very beautiful wooden shrine in the middle of a clearing in the forest, where friends who go there on retreat have a chance to paint their vows, their aspirations on tiles and place them as art within that shrine. I took a photo of one of the vows that was there, and I found it incredibly insightful. It read, "I vow to attain nothing." And in the first verse of this poem, we find a very similar insight and invitation to that vow, and also the invitation of the 14 mindfulness trainings of the Order of Interbeing. An invitation to do what we most often don't want to do on a deep level, despite how we try to convince ourselves otherwise. To let go of accumulated layers and uncover the wisdom within, to not take on even more views and fixed positions. Buddhism, and more particularly the practice of cultivating right view, is, as I've said earlier and repeatedly, not taking on another set of views, but rather having the courage to look deeply into the deep roots of all of each and every one of our deeply held and dearly beloved views, and to realize that they're merely lenses through which we categorize our experience and create ideas about truth, or about reality, or about ourselves, or about others, rather than touching reality itself. These notions and ideas are not reality in and of themselves, even as we spend most of our time utterly convinced, completely convinced that they are. In this stanza also, we find a reflection of a later teaching, a teaching that blossomed and developed, and we find quite strongly in the Zen tradition. The teaching of being a true person with no fixed position. In the records of Master Linchi, Master Rinzai, the founder of our lineage, he was one of the greatest Zen masters. We read the following. At that point, a monk came up and asked, what is the true person of no position? And the master, Master Linchi, Master Rinzai, stepped down from the meditation platform, grabbed the monk and said, speak, speak. What is the real person with no position? The monk was confused. Master Rinzai let go of him and said, the real person with no position is no more than dried excrement on a stick. You can read the entire exchange in Tei's, our teacher's wonderful book, Zen Battles. So Tei, in these talks that he gave on the records of Master Linchi, which later became that book, Zen Battles, says in part, the word position in the sentence in the story above, it actually says a person of no position, is often understood to mean our status in society. We live our whole life thinking our feelings and our flesh are the sum total of our true person. Our true person has no position, is not inside or outside, is not tricked by birth and death, by coming and going, by having or not having, by what we do or what we don't do. Our true person can't be found by means of our intellect, our reasoning. We know that we're more than that. So our position here, and more particularly our position in society, is merely the outer level, the outer aspect of what's meant by this word position. The deeper level means to look and see from which form of a created self, a rigid sense of who we are or what another thing or another person is in each moment, that we base our response from. So no position here means that we don't base our response on a precarious position based on selfing or self-interest. Just like Tei's story of the spontaneous action of one hand grasping onto the thumb of another hand when it's hit by a hammer. Another important line in the story from the records of Master Linchi here is no more than dry excrement on a stick. So Master Rinzai, Master Linchi, uses an image that's quite different to the one that we might have of a true or a real or a realized person. We tend to think of a true person, a realized person as pure and noble, and we ascribe all of those associations to that person. So Master Rinzai uses this image of dried excrement to balance out this tendency that we have. Since if we have a set view about what our true person is, then that view has no more value than a piece of dried excrement. Now, Brother Tenzin, who lives here at Mountain Spring, just ordered a truckload of chicken excrement for the organic farm out the back, and we actually paid for it. So it might be that there's actually more value in poop, in excrement than we tend to think, but you get the point. So let's have a sound of the bell. Let's continue on with verse 2. Now, how would a person led on by their desires, entrenched in their likes, and forming conclusions from this basis, overcome their own views, since they view them as reality? So here in this verse, we go a little bit more deeply into seeing how, if we haven't cultivated sensitivity and discernment to what's arising in our consciousness in each and every moment, and also, I would say, considering what's arising in every moment with a grain of salt, asking ourselves, am I really sure? Then it's actually our desire, whether it manifests in terms of greed, of ill will, or of confusion, of not seeing clearly, that actually gives rise to many of our views and positions. The positions that we call reality or truth or the way things are, but then in actuality are quite far from it. In the Discourse on Youth and Happiness, we read a very interesting verse. If we think that we're greater, if we think that we're less than, or we think that we're equal, we cause dissension. And this current stanza, this current verse in the poem helps us to understand the gatha that the Buddha offers in this Discourse on Youth and Happiness. Since here we understand that most of our positions, most of our views, rather than manifesting from inside, actually arise out of our desires and our attachments to our likes, our dislikes, and a fixed position of who we are and who another person is in every moment. When we consider a later poem in the text, we'll reflect on the three complexes of greater, less than, and equal in some greater depth. But for now, we'll just continue on with verse 3. Whoever boasts to others unasked of their self, their practices, their precepts, and their virtues is the skilled say of ignoble nature. Wouldn't it be a better place if everybody practiced exactly like us? Since many times we have a feeling that we are the ones that practice perfectly and everybody else, they just don't quite measure up. Here we have this invitation in quite a strong way to let go of the idea of our own superiority, or to think that we're somehow better than others, or to have an idea of our practice as something that we create a whole self around, a whole identity around, a whole set of positions and notions and ideas and rituals around. In a very famous sutra that's called the Sutra of 42 Chapters, which was the first text, it said, translated into Chinese. Wonder if anybody knows what the second one was. That's right. It was my beloved sutra, the Discourse on the 8 Realizations of Great Beings. It was translated by Master Anshikao. In the Sutra of 42 Chapters, which is dearly beloved in the Chinese traditions, we read a very pertinent verse. The Buddha said, "My Dharma is the mindfulness that is both mindfulness and non-mindfulness. It's the practice that is both practice and non-practice. It's the words that are words and non-words, and the cultivation that is both cultivation and non-cultivation. Those who understand this are near to it. Those who are confused by this are far away indeed. It is not accessible by the path of language. It's not hindered by physical objects. If you're off by a hair's breadth, you'll lose it in an instant." I'll never forget drinking tea with Tay back in the year 2004. It was when we had the 3-month winter retreat in Deer Park Monastery, when the whole of the monastics who were ordained at that time in the Plum Village lineage came together. And Tay and I were drinking tea together. And Tay said to me, "You know what, Brother Papai, if we practice deeply in Mahayana Buddhism, there's a teaching that if we're able to look deeply, There's nothing that's not Dharma. And we see this insight so clearly in that verse from the Sutra of 42 chapters, that practice is not something that we do. Well, maybe in the beginning it is, but as we develop along the path, hopefully it becomes an expression of our inner being, something that we are, not a whole ideology and set of rituals and self to hold on to. And while it's extraordinary to have met these teachings, extraordinary to understand them to a certain extent, even if just a little bit, and extraordinary to have the capacity to put some of these practices and these teachings into practice in our daily life, to apply them in our daily life. It's also nothing special at all. It's not something to build up a whole identity around, but rather something that should be helping us day by day to release layers that we've covered over that deep place of openness and spaciousness within. So the fourth verse reads, "But that practitioner who is serene at heart and praises neither their own self, practices, or virtue, not labeling themselves I in this. The wise would praise them, calling them a noble one. Such a person no longer has any arrogance or vanity for anything in the world." When I read this, I was reflecting on the fact that if we're not careful and attentive, the shadow side of our practice is that it can become a lot about ourself. My peace, my joy, my happiness, my positions, and my views. Or as I like to share it, it can become a lot about the Holy Trinity of the I, the me, and the my. As meditators, on our journey, the journey of our heart is the journey from the small I to the big I. In China, there's a very famous koan. In fact, when we were traveling in China, there was even a song that was made about this koan, a question for reflection. Nian fo shi shui, Nian fo ti tui, I think it is in Vietnamese. Who is the person that's reciting the Buddha's name? Who is the one? Who is the person who's reciting the Buddha's name? As we practice with this question, with this koan that has no logical answer, many insights emerge, but one of the insights is that there's no such thing as a separate self. We interact. Our peace, our happiness, our well-being is the peace, happiness, and well-being of everybody. And the same is true of suffering. Here in this verse, we're being asked to reflect on examining our approach to our practice and also the way in which we engage with our daily life. What framework do we use? A framework of I am doing this for you, which arises from a sense of separation, or perhaps one of the complexes that we explored earlier. And that way we have a sense of the I in every action that's referred to in the verse above. One of the most famous sutras in the Mahayana tradition, in the Diamond Sutra, we read about a bodhisattva, and more specifically, a bodhisattva action being to work to rescue all living beings, to benefit all living beings, but at the same time, understanding that in reality, not a single living being has been saved, has been rescued or benefited. The seed of that insight is found here in this verse, and it's a deeply transformational practice to consider in each action whether we're selfing in some subtle or less subtle way. Also in this verse, there are three interesting frameworks presented which relate to the three basic unwholesome roots in Buddhist psychology. There's arrogance mentioned, and arrogance arises from the root of ill will, a closing down of the heart, a firming up of a superior position of some form. There's vanity, which arises out of this root of greed, and then praising oneself, arising out of delusion, of confusion. Because if we're praising ourselves, then there's this idea, this notion of ourselves as a separate self, as separate from everybody else. So these three qualities, these three frameworks are not the same as, I don't want anybody to get a wrong idea here and take the wrong end of the stick that Master Rinzai was describing earlier. That wouldn't end well. This is not the same as reflecting on our own virtues, reflecting on our own good qualities and things which the Buddha specifically invited us to do, but rather to look at the ways in which we operate from a sense of separation, a sense of isolation. And so this verse is an invitation for us to look into the ways that we interact. So verse number 5, those whose views or doctrines arise from their own unpurified thinking, giving preference to these imagined, constructed and conventional views when it is to their self-advantage, such a person relies on a peace that can easily be shaken. Earlier in this talk, we mentioned that this poem reminds us to reflect on the positions that we take, the foundations on which we choose to stand in each and every moment, and to reflect on the roots of those. Most of the time in our heart of hearts, when we're holding on to a particular view or ideology or so on, we hold on to it because somehow we unconsciously think it's to our advantage. Self-advantage in this verse here refers to the tendency that I shared earlier to build up a barrier created of our views, our positions, and so on, which we operate out of in order to both create and to protect our idea of ourselves. And this does bring about a kind of peace, which actually, as I mentioned earlier, is a kind of a peace that's under siege all the time. And funnily enough, by doing this, we actively co-create and nurture quite diligently, in fact, the root of our own suffering, just as through actually applying these teachings, we can actively co-create the roots of our own liberation. The fortress that we've built up so diligently is liable to be broken down at any moment, even with things such as new information or new discoveries. As we read in the 14 mindfulness trainings, we don't think that the knowledge we presently possess is changeless absolute truth. We understand that truth is found in life, and we're ready to observe life within and around us in every moment, ready to learn throughout our lives. I can't think of anything more important, more radical, and possibly for some of us more frightening than that statement, that invitation, that commitment in the 14 mindfulness trainings. Also, if you were listening to this verse closely, you'll notice that in this verse, we hear of imagined, constructed, and conventional views. And for those of you that have studied a little of Buddhist psychology, you've read Understanding Our Mind, the 40 verses on mind, then you'll see that here there's also a relationship to the modes of cognition, things in themselves, mere images, and so on, that are that we understand as frameworks for views in Buddhist psychology. And we'll be exploring those as we touch some of the later poems, these three main ways through which we construct reality. So verse number 6, entrenchment in views are not easily overcome, especially when one considers what doctrines we grasp onto. In fact, that's usually why someone embraces or rejects a doctrine, in light of these very entrenchments themselves. In this verse, we hear the word entrenchments. And entrenchments is a translation of the Pali term nivasana. In the past, as I've mentioned before, rather than using technical terms such as these, I've used metaphors such as tracks in the carpet. Since I think and I observe that people remember these images much more easily than the technical terms. But as I mentioned last week, I really like the translation entrenchments or nivasana. I find it a very helpful framework to use in my own practice, and I hope you do as well. We can be entrenched in our behavior, in our thinking, and so on. And most often, we're not just entrenched in a little rut or in a ditch, where we've created a whole underground city crafted out of our own habit energies, our strategies, our opinions, and our very sophisticated avoidance mechanisms. So nivasana can be also translated as abode or home. A few years ago, I shared with friends that traditionally a monastic is called a left home person. Home here can be a physical place, and we do leave our physical homes, but that's not the deeper meaning of leaving home in the spiritual sense. Leaving home on a deeper level is an invitation to reflect on what we habitually return to and call home, whether it is in terms of our ideas or perceptions or behaviors and so on, that place where there are small comforts, and to discover, to be willing to push the envelope to discover our real home in each and every moment. So in this verse, we're invited to look at which views and notions we've made ourselves a home out of, and ask ourselves why we've done that. We're also offered a very surprising reflection in this verse. We're told that often the very practices or views or dharmas that we hold on to and believe as true, notice that it's believe as true, not experience as true. There's a very important distinction there. That we reject as false actually arise or tend to arise out of these very entrenchments themselves. That if we're not careful and discerning, we can actually try to use the Dharma in a way that supports our entrenchments rather than to transform them. I think one important reflection here is to consider whether we're challenging ourselves and our assumptions each and every day, or whether we feel ill at ease, irritated, scared, defensive, and so on when something challenges us or our assumptions and opinions. Speaking of the Dharma, in the Diamond Sutra we read, because that person is not caught in the idea and notions of a self, a person, a living being, or a lifespan. They are not caught in the idea of a Dharma or the idea of a non-Dharma. He or she is not caught in the notion that this is a sign and this is not a sign. Why? If you're caught in the idea of a Dharma, then you're also caught in the ideas of a self, a person, a living being, or a lifespan. If you're caught in the idea that there is no Dharma, you're still caught in the idea of a self, a person, a living being, and a lifespan. That is why we should not get caught in dharmas or in the idea that dharmas do not exist. This is the hidden meaning when the Buddha says, bhikshus, monks, you should know that all of the teachings that I give to you are a raft. All teachings must be abandoned, not to mention non-teachings. Let's enjoy a sound of the bell. Let's continue with verse number 7. Now, one who is cleansed does not form preconceived views about states of becoming or not becoming anywhere in the world. Having abandoned conceit and illusion, by what means would they continue on, since they're no longer caught up in attachment? So please remember that the world here is not only the world outside, but the world inside. And when we're talking about continuing on, we're not only talking about physical birth, but the birth of new states of becoming, which can be ideas or notions or new forms of a notion of self. In the first line of this stanza, the word cleansed refers to having our views cleansed through clear seeing, of asking ourselves over and over again in each and every moment, am I sure? We also have an invitation to look at the ways in which we may have preconceived notions about becoming or not becoming. Since we've discussed and reflected on becoming and not becoming quite a lot in previous talks, I'll focus on the other aspect today, which is to look at our preconceived notions. The capacity to meet each moment as a new moment is called in Buddhism the beginner's mind. And in this sentence here, we have this invitation. We can have a tendency to become jaded, to think that we've discovered all that we need to know. The interesting thing is that if we're attentive, then just when we think we've discovered everything, just when we think we've discovered everything we think we can discover about a particular experience or person or idea, whether it's our breath, our step, a mental formation, another person, or so on, there's always something more to discover. Being ready to learn throughout our lives means exactly this, to meet each moment, to meet each encounter in a fresh and new way. Letting go of conceit is another interesting phrase in this verse. Conceit is one key form of selfing. And for the list lovers, we won't really go into this list tonight, but just out of interest, in the text, there's actually 9 forms of conceit that are listed, but they're all basically based on our tendency to consider ourselves or others as better or worse or equal in any situation. The issue here is our continual comparison of ourselves to others, who we consider separate than ourselves. Having abandoned conceit and illusion, by what means would they continue on since they're not caught up in attachment? Here we're reminded that the endless round of becoming and samsara is not something that just happens to us. This process is a process that we actively buy into and we participate in. By practicing to recognize and let go of conceit and see things as they truly are, then this tendency to cling madly to anything, literally anything, that we think will take away that pain, even momentarily, will over time lessen and will have the possibility to transform this inward and outward cycle. Verse 8, the one who is still attached enters into doctrinal debates. But if one is unattached, how could they take sides? For such a person with no self and nothing that is opposed to the self, embraces nothing, rejects nothing, shakes off all views right here and now, relying on none. So in this final verse, we're offered an invitation to consider the various ways that we move away from the middle path into an either or an or mentality, with no self and nothing that's in opposition to the self, because either of these positions would be a position based on this thirst for becoming or for getting rid of. Embracing nothing, but also rejecting nothing. This final verse includes a strong statement that the wise one has shaken off views right here and now. And this is a strong reminder that we're not practicing to attain something in the future, but rather to touch it right here and right now. This is one of the most important Dharma seals of Palm Village practice, that the thing that we're looking for is and needs to be available for us right here and now. There's so much in this beautiful poem that we'll be exploring together over the next 2 weeks. At best, what I could offer in the time that we have together are a few pointing out instructions, and I hope that you will spend the next 2 weeks reflecting on the poem yourself and uncover some of the deep and profound layers of meaning for yourself. I hope that you've enjoyed this talk this evening. It's certainly been a joy to be together with everybody. Let's end with the sound of the bell.